We're hearing a lot about home. So for our safety and the safety of others, we've been advised that if we can stay at home, we should stay at home. Some of you in other states are experiencing a little more freedom than we are here in Melbourne, but we're still mostly at home down here. And what this advice, I think, has highlighted to all of us is that home really provides a safety and a refuge for most people. But what of those of us without homes, and what of those in situations where we're precarious and we're vulnerable to losing our homes? People who may never have imagined themselves as vulnerable are facing a much starker reality in the face of the pandemic. And at the moment, I think for most of us, if not all of us, life is much more uncertain. And we're not sure what it's going to look like when we come out the other side. So pre-pandemic research shows us that we're already facing considerable obstacles to housing our most vulnerable communities. Housing precarity has been compounded by decades of rising house prices, which have driven up rental prices. There's been insufficient funding and investment in public housing. We are seeing rising inequity, not only in Australia, but across the globe. And the casualisation of the workforce has created insecure and uncertain working conditions, and we're seeing the effects of that now with the pandemic as well. So in this context, we're seeing an increasing need for affordable rental housing options aimed at our most vulnerable communities. Research shows us that Australia is currently facing a shortfall of over 400,000 social housing dwellings, and that's as of 2018. So we need that many more. And to eliminate this backlog by 2036 and to plan for the future and plan for future needs, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, AHURI, estimates that we create 36,000 housing units annually. So that's quite significant. In the City of Melbourne Council area alone, so just the council area, not the broader City of Melbourne, there's a current shortfall of 5,500 affordable homes. And predictions suggest that over 23,000 affordable housing units will be needed by 2036. So while the economic and social fallout of the pandemic may well exacerbate our housing problems, what we're seeing is that the pandemic is also shining a light on the need to care for our vulnerable, and that governments are taking notice. So the good news, I suppose, this week is that the Victorian government has announced that the over 2,000 homeless people that they have put up in hotels during the pandemic will be able to stay until April next year, and that they will work to find them secure, stable, long-term rental housing. But I think, you know, it's a great moment to ask what more needs to be done to break the cycle of homelessness. We probably won't ever eradicate it, but there are some wonderful people working in this area, and we'll be speaking to some of them today. So in terms of our conversation today, we know that single women over the age of 45 are the fastest growing cohort of homeless people in Australia, and that pandemic restrictions are hitting women particularly hard. So in light of this, our discussion will look at how easy it is for women to slip into homelessness, the policies that aim to make a difference and the people who are kind of making that difference, and what is being done to help women who need homes find homes. So we have with us today lawyer Merinda Dutton, the writer Jane Gilmore, the CEO of Servants Community Housing Merinda Dutton, and Jeanette, the CEO of Women's Property Initiative. And each of these women provides a different perspective on women and housing. And what we'll see over the course of this discussion is that while homelessness affects women differently, depending on their circumstances and their stage of life, at the core, what this conversation comes down to is providing homes, not just housing, so not kind of the bare bones and the bare necessity, but homes for women in vulnerable situations. So I'd like to just start, I suppose, after that framing by giving a brief introduction and allowing each of our speakers to tell you a little bit more about themselves. So I'm going to start with Jane Gilmore today. Jane Gilmore, as I mentioned before, is a writer. She was the founding editor of the King's Tribune and is now a freelance journalist and author. She has a particular interest in feminism, media and data journalism, and she has a Master's of Journalism from the University of Melbourne. Her book, Fixed It, Violence and Representation of Women in the Media, was published by Penguin Random House in August 2019. And if you've seen any of the headlines that Jane fixes on social media, the work that she's doing is incredibly important to shine a light on the way we talk about domestic violence in the media at large. So I'd like to start by asking Jane, you've written articles for The Age and Meanjin about women and homelessness. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what you do and where your interest in women and housing comes from.
Yep, absolutely. Before we do, there's just one thing I'd like to say, and I just want to make this clear. I do this at every event that I speak at now. And it started about a year ago when I was doing an event at the Melbourne Writers Festival, and I was on a panel with Lydia Thorpe, and we had the, I was asked to do the acknowledgement of country, and it felt like tokenism. And I said to her, is there something more that I can say than just reading out the same thing over and over again? And Lydia, being the awesome woman that she is, said, I don't give a, let's say, damn about your words, pay the rent. So I have on my phone now in Safari, I have the Aboriginal Legal Services page always open, and every time I hear an acknowledgement of country, I donate $1, and every time I have an audience, I ask the audience to do the same thing. Now, particularly today, maybe not the legal service, maybe one of the Aboriginal services for homeless people, but that's a way of preventing just listening to the acknowledgement as tokenism, actually doing something about it. It's only $1, and I'll get into it in a minute, but that most of the time I'm able to do it, even if sometimes I have to say, let's wait until payday next month and make a note of it. So just having said that and repeating Lydia's awesome words, and if you get the opportunity, also pass it on to everybody you can think of. So to answer your question about my interest in homelessness, it actually came about well before I had any experience with it. I've been a journalist for far too long, and I've been writing about the issues that particularly affect women for most of that time. And so I had done a lot of work on the financial issues that affect women, like the gender pay gap, unpaid labour, lack of superannuation, all these things. And I had a very, very good intellectual understanding of it. And then a couple of years ago, I got the lived experience understanding of it that was not anything like what I expected it to be like. Some of you may have read the article that I wrote for Meanjin about it. Before it happened, I used to joke with my friends who were also writers and journalists that I'm one broken arm away from homelessness, because if I break my arm, I can't write. If I can't write, I don't get paid, 3 paychecks, and I'm out, can't pay my rent, got nowhere to go. But it was never something that I thought would really happen until it did. And this was, you know, as I said, a couple of years before COVID, so it was unexpected. And the things that I learned through that was how protected I am by white middle-class privilege. It was white middle-class privilege that pulled me out. It was having family who could help. It was having connections that could get me back into work again. It was all the things that made it easy for me to pull myself back up again, that if they didn't exist, I would not be sitting here talking to all of you now. I would be sleeping in my car somewhere, and I would not have written the book that I wrote, and I would not have gone to Melbourne University and got that master's degree. None of that would have happened. I'd be sleeping in my car somewhere, and it would be really cold. I would have lost my children. That was within days of happening before some of my family were able to step in. And I think it's also important to think now that if that were to happen again, which it very easily could, a lot of those middle-class privilege barriers that stop us falling off that cliff, they're weakening. Because those people who stepped in last time, the family who helped me pay my rent, all those friends who would leave casserole dishes on my back doorstep to keep us fed, they don't have that capacity anymore. Those things are changing, and that particularly for older women, particularly for single mothers, which I was, particularly for women who've come from leaving difficult marriages. We know the breaking points, they are all the breaking points. It's long-term history of even erratic employment or intermittent employment, or being self-employed in the gig economy as I was, so there's no accumulation of back pay, holiday pay, all those things that you think that you're always going to have, or think that those safety nets are there even when they're not, and the shock that comes when all those safety nets are ripped away has a lot to do with the way women's work is valued and paid. It has an enormous amount to do with the way we understand what men and women bring to marriages and to childcare. It has an enormous amount to do with how we understand, particularly how governments think about people who end up in financial trouble, which is, the approach usually seems to be punitive, particularly for single mothers and the homeless, where the attitude is that you've done this to yourself through laziness, shiftlessness, just general fecklessness, rather than women. And this thing that Tania was talking about, these women over 45 who are coming into the end of their life and have worked hard all their life, maybe not necessarily always in paid work, but these women have worked incredibly hard all their life and have ended up in situations that are really, really dangerous. And it's not something that's talked about because women over 45 are invisible in so many ways. And I think, looking at all the faces on my screen right now, I think we all know that that happens in media, in advertising, in government, in policy, in almost every area of life. Women over 45 are forgotten. They are irrelevant apart from other women. And then it becomes a women's issue, and it's an older women's issue. So we are forced into a smaller and smaller niche. These are all the things that we need to be looking at when we're talking about both short-term and long-term change. So I think I've yabbered on enough for now, and I'd like to move it on to somebody else for a bit.
I think there's lots of questions that I've already got just hearing you speak, but I think I'll move it around and then we can hopefully get everywhere, or most of the way to where we need to get going further, because I think women over 45 who are kind of sliding into homelessness, I think there's a long track there, but there are kind of also different ways you can end up homeless. So we'll touch a little bit on them and hopefully circle back around to some of those issues. So I'd like now to introduce Merinda Dutton. Merinda Dutton proudly identifies as a Gumbaynggirr Barkindji woman, and she's a senior lawyer at Legal Aid New South Wales as part of the Civil Law Service for Aboriginal communities. In 2019, Merinda was awarded Indigenous Legal Professional of the Year at the National Indigenous Legal Conference in Darwin. And she sounds just incredibly impressive. Her work concentrates on delivering services to Aboriginal people in remote and regional New South Wales, including in prisons. And Merinda's also the co-founder of the Blackfuller Book Club on Instagram, which I've discovered since she's been on this panel, and I'm hoping to get some of the books, so I'm quite excited for that. Anyway, I was hoping, Merinda, that you could tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and how you help women find housing. It's quite different from the other speakers we have on the panel.
Yeah, sure. So the service that I work for was founded in around 2015, and really came out of recognition that there was a lot of unmet civil law need in Aboriginal communities, and that when those civil law needs go unmet, it can create further problems and potentially things like incarceration. And when you're talking about Aboriginal people, you're talking about the most vulnerable people in our community. And it was interesting to hear you talk about home, and when I think about that as an Aboriginal person, you can't talk about that without talking about land, and you can't talk about that without talking about the disconnection and displacement that has happened throughout our history. And I think you also can't talk about women over 45 without talking about their collective contexts and about the way that they exist within communities. And often they exist with you know, in relationships of reciprocity, and quite often they have obligations to other people in their communities, and those people have obligations to them. And so they don't exist in this kind of individualistic kind of way, and they don't just exist at this time. They exist with all that kind of contextual background behind them, that historical background. And I set that out because when I think about the women that I see in custody, and particularly the women I've seen over 45, those women are often people who have been institutionalized by government policies. And the women over 45 that I've seen, those in custody, have often been removed under a policy of assimilation, and then have spent the rest of their lives in institutions, including in prison and homeless. And so they've fallen through every single gap. And then when you think about that, then and the relationships they have to other people in their communities and the obligations they have to those other people in their communities, how that affects other people too. And people that they have obligations to, like their children. And it really is a cycle, and it's about intergenerational trauma. I don't know if I've answered your question at all, but so the work that I do in custody is mostly, so we deliver a fortnightly service at Silverwater Correctional Centre, and that clinic is, the purpose of that clinic is to address housing issues for Aboriginal women in custody, and that service was established out of some research which showed that Aboriginal women were more likely than non-Aboriginal women to be homeless before entering custody, and then they were even more likely to be homeless when they left custody. And I think when I think about that, I think about the visibility of Aboriginal women in terms of homelessness, and what leads those women to end up in custody if they are actually homeless and living on the streets, where a white woman might not experience the same visibility that would lead them to end up in custody. And so in terms of the legal services that we provide to those women, it's really about, mostly it's about social housing. And a lot of the women we see are trying to get on the housing list or stay on the housing list, the public housing list, that is. And if they already have a house, it's about trying to get them in a position where they can keep that house, because that's like gold, having a house. And then the other end of the spectrum is situations where women have had homes in the past, and for whatever reason they've lost that tenancy, and they now face barriers to getting housing in the future. And that probably is the hardest situation to be in terms of barriers to getting a home.
So what is there a kind of an instance you can think of where you can kind of talk us through what happens and how you might deal with it, what the barriers actually are?
Yeah, so in terms of those women where they've never had a house, they've been on the waiting list. Quite often what I see in my client group is, especially for the chronically homeless, that they've been on the housing waiting list for a number of years. The housing waiting list in New South Wales is significant. I think it's over 50,000 on the waiting list right now. People can be on the waiting list for over 10 years. You hear of people being on the housing list for longer than that. And so there is a challenge in getting on the list because there are so many bureaucratic barriers to just getting to that point, just getting on the list. And then there are barriers in terms of staying on the list once you're on it, because what the department does is they'll send out these letters saying, please get in touch with us. And if they don't, then they're taken off the list. And then when they apply again, they start their waiting time all over again. Yeah, and so for the clients that I see, particularly people who have been chronically homeless, just engaging enough with the department to the point where they can even stay on the list is a challenge, particularly if they're living on the streets, they don't have a fixed address. Yeah, it's very hard. And, you know, for a lot of the women I see, they can't read and write. They don't have any form of ID. Some women's birth hasn't even been registered. And so the barriers to just getting your name on a list are significant. And then, so once you're on the list, then you have to be able to stay on it to be able to get a house. And then in terms of being at the other end of the spectrum where you've had a house in the past and you've lost it for whatever reason, what can happen is the department can give you a classification. You can essentially be blacklisted from public housing. And what a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that they've got this certain classification, which potentially means they can't get back on the list. And so a lot of our work as lawyers is finding out what people's status is and about appealing those classifications and putting to the department why they should put the person back on the list.
That's amazing. So it takes an incredible amount of expertise just to navigate getting on a list, which is
essentially, yeah.
Which is really quite frightening. I mean, I think there's a similar housing shortfall. I think the waiting list in Victoria is similar to the waiting list in New South Wales, and it's incredibly challenging. I think it's quite interesting to think about invisibility at both ends of the spectrum. We might move just now to Amanda to talk about another kind of a different perspective yet again. I should say that when I chatted to Merinda before, she deals a lot not only with older women but also younger women. So this kind of idea that Merinda is hopefully starting to break the cycle at a certain point in their lives does give me some hope at least. Anyway, so Amanda, welcome. Amanda's the CEO of Servants Community Housing. It's a not-for-profit that provides safe, secure, low-cost housing in East Melbourne. In the 1990s, Amanda lived on site as a manager of a boarding house managed by servants, and the experience changed her life. She then moved to the Northern Territory and worked in East Arnhem Land and Darwin for 15 years in the areas of community development and adult education. Amanda returned to Melbourne in 2010 to work with Servants Community Housing and has been involved in the growth of the organisation from one property housing 38 people to 4 properties housing 95 people. Amanda, Servants Community Housing provides housing to both men and women. Can you give us a general understanding of your work with Servants Community Housing and elaborate on the housing that you provide specifically for women?
Sure, thanks Tania, and thanks Jane. That was a really helpful tip for Welcome to Country. I loved it. Thanks for having me. I'll just talk a little bit about my journey and talk about housing. So as Tania said, my introduction into social housing was a little bit by accident back in the late 80s when my husband and I moved into a boarding house as managers, and this was a boarding house that had recently been acquired by a local, or not, was managed by a local church. It was actually owned by the government, and that's something that the government was doing back then, was buying up some of the old properties that used to be boarding houses and were being sold back to the private market, and often local community groups would band together to try and save people from going onto the street. And this is what this particular church did. They formed a committee of management, and they became the managers of that particular property. It was something that the church saw obviously as a service to people that were in need, but this particular church had a very strong community focus and tried very hard to serve the community, hence this name, Servants. They would do things like run a medical service where the doctors used to hop onto bikes and their push bikes and go around and visit patients in their house rather than patients having to go to the clinic. So that was sort of the background, very community focused, very intent on creating a home for the people. So when they first took it over and they realised that the boarding house it was a boarding house and it had meals, that there were no tablecloths they didn't have tablecloths. The first manager there made sure that tablecloths were brought out because that's what they did in their home, and she was convinced that that's, it helped create that sense of eating around a table, making dinner special, getting people talking to each other. And for some of the people there, they'd never had dinner on a tablecloth, on a table with a cloth. So we were there. It was an amazing experience, really, when you think, I was probably 25 or something when I first went in. We were there for nearly 4 years. We had our 2 kids that were there with us. And just such an eye-opener, from being a quiet little girl brought up in the eastern suburbs and then living in this environment with people that I'd never really had exposure to before or never mixed with before. People and mainly men. Back then there was probably 25 men, 4 women in the house. People that were prisoners, ex-prisoners, unemployed, not too many people with mental health issues, and a lot of the people had work, lowly paid work, garbage collectors, manual labourers, and that was sort of common, the common mix of people that lived in boarding houses in the eastern suburbs back then. As I said, we had meals. They were given linen every week. They had to clean their own rooms, but there'd be shared bathrooms, one lounge room that people could watch TV in. So a real absolute eye-opener, and I guess back then I was, we were both, my husband and I were hooked, and we decided to stick with the sort of social justice theme, and we moved to Arnhem Land. When I was there, I was involved in a crisis centre, dealing with trying to house women with experiencing domestic violence. Majority then up there and probably still are Indigenous women. Then worked in a women's centre, and Merinda, listening to you just brought back a flood of memories. After being in the women's centre, I moved to Darwin and was working in a college for adults, centering mainly on women, although we opened it up to families or their husbands later. But the issues that Merinda was describing, unfortunately, it sounds like it's still true and real as it was back then. So we were focusing on trying to just teach people English, working out that they didn't have a birth certificate, they couldn't get, and housing. It wasn't just come and do your English. It was all-encompassing education program. When I was in Darwin, I guess the thing that struck me was that these people were always struggling and they were always financially poor, but they were kept together because of the family connections kept them strong and kept them happy. And it was, I always just found it amazing, because I think if that was me, I would not be smiling or wouldn't be laughing the way that they were. And it kept I was always reminded about how lucky I was to be, that I wasn't poor, and not because of anything special about me, but it was purely the family I was brought into, and the location that we were, and the colour of our skin. So the passion for me has always been about empowering people and about communities. And when it was time for me to move back to Melbourne, my heart just was brought back to servants and the work that they were doing, because I knew that it was still an ongoing organisation, and that they still had the same passion that they had back then, to keep people housed and to keep people in community and to keep people safe. So I was thrilled to come back and work with the organisation, but amazed when I came back at some of the differences in the house, and the makeup of the people that were there. So very few people that were working, and high proportion of people with mental health issues, huge mental health issues. And still about the same ratio of women, so not many. In 2012, the organisation took over an aged care centre, an old one, and we converted it into one of another house. And we noticed that every time we had some women in, we only had 5, but every time a female moved out, we would leave that room vacant to try and fill it with another woman. But it would take weeks and weeks and weeks, and in the end we would have to give up, and we would backfill it with a male. And then, of course, gradually there's only one woman left, and then when she eventually left, we couldn't, it became an all-male facility or home. So when we opened up another one in 2016, we decided that we would leave one wing specifically for the women. We do tend to fill that fairly easily, but generally when people ring up on the phone and they find out that there are men in the home, they don't want to know anything about it. And despite the fact, it doesn't matter how hard we try and sell the place and tell them how lovely our men are and how safe they will be, and how we have managers on site and how it's a special wing and we've got security cameras and they'd have their own bathroom, they just are too scared and they don't want to come in. So given that, we decided, well, we obviously need a house just for women with no males. And in 2018, we opened up a small one. We have a house with 7 rooms, and one of them has our manager a lady living there. She's sort of on staff, sort of not. She has a job that she goes to every day, but at night time she comes home to live with the women. So again, it's that community support, just keeping an eye out for each other. Amazingly, we thought we would be flooded. It would be really easy to fill the rooms. And to be honest, we could, but not necessarily with the women that we thought. So we thought that we would get all the over 45s. You know, it's a beautiful house in Hawthorne. It was just newly renovated. The lovely furnishings, all brand new. It could have been an Airbnb property, but the typical demographic that we thought that we would get, we didn't get. What the majority of the people, that women that were applying, had fairly chronic mental health issues and were a bit younger. And people tend to come and go in the house, whereas the other houses that we've got with the males, they tend to stay. We've got guys that have been there for 30 years. Well, in this house, people come, they maybe come stay for a year, and then the women find somewhere else to go. So it's been a real learning experience for us, a surprise, and we've got new things that we want to do for women, but it's just not. Women are different, and they require a different sort of home environment. So I might leave that there.
I mean, I think it's incredibly interesting already. We're starting to see the many different ways you can come to homelessness, be you a man or a woman, I would suggest, and the complexity of the situation. I'm sure we're not really going to do it complete justice in the 2 hours that we have, but already touching on it, I think is a really kind of powerful thing, and there's some really deeply important things that we need to start thinking about. Having talked about women in this type of housing, I might move on now to Jeanette. Jeanette Large is the CEO of Women's Property Initiatives, WPI. She's a Bachelor of Behavioural Science and a graduate diploma in Business Management. In 2015, she was a Telstra Women's Business Awards finalist. She's a certified housing professional with the Australasian Housing Institute and a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Jeanette, through WPI, helps disadvantaged women regain independence by providing good quality, safe, appropriate, inclusionary and secure housing. Jeanette, we've just heard a little bit from Amanda about the kind of housing differences that she sees that women require in relation to men. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about the work that you do with WPI and what this means for the women that you house.
Thanks, Tania. And Jane, as Amanda said, I also thank you for that in a different way of acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. I think it's fantastic in saying, just pay the rent. So thank you for that. Thanks, Tania. So Women's Property Initiatives, we develop and we provide affordable rental housing for women-headed households, vulnerable, disadvantaged women-headed households. So the women we house, they may or may not have children. The properties that we own and manage are a mixture of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments and 3 and 4 bedroom houses. And clearly the households, the women that we house, are housed appropriately depending on the size of the family. I think many people who work in the housing field, as Amanda has demonstrated, have an absolute passion. You know, people like us who have been, I started working in youth housing back in the mid-80s, and it just gets into you about the importance of providing, and as some of the chats I've seen coming through, the importance of providing a home, you know, not just a roof over someone's head. And clearly what we see for many of the women that we're housing is they've had a roof over their heads, but that hasn't been a very good roof over their heads, and they need to get out of it. You know, they need to escape family violence, and where it might be just them or both themselves and their children. It's not, you know, it hasn't been an environment that they should or are able to continue to live in. But you know, we focus on women-headed households, and a lot of that is because housing stress and homelessness to some extent is an incredibly deeply engendered issue as far as we're concerned, as far as our organisation's concerned. It's been mentioned, you know, Tania, you mentioned in your introduction, homelessness is the growing fastest among women, and particularly older women. And what it does is it's actually reflecting the absolute inherent financial disadvantage that that women face. And this, you know, and this financial disadvantage is absolutely based on gender inequality that it's experienced in every stage of a woman's life, really. And some of the articles that were attached to the invitation really demonstrate that, you know, such good demonstration of what can happen throughout a woman's life that, you know, ends up resulting in financial disadvantage at so many stages. So, you know, some of the, I don't know how many, I'll go through some of the information and statistics of why we focus on women. You know, people know that women are earning, you know, still 14% less than men if they're in equivalent jobs, that more women live in poverty than men. 82% of single parents are women, and three times more likely to live in poverty. The thing that we're really experiencing right now, aren't we, throughout COVID, the fact that 71% of employees in education, health and the community sector are women. 40% of those in those sectors are part-time or casual employees. Has this not hit home and incredibly during this COVID virus? Are we going to see an explosion of the need for more housing? You know, yes, we're currently housing homeless people in hotels. We have Job Seeker that's increased. We have Job Keeper, which is keeping some people employed. Once all of those, how can we refer to it? Those sort of measures that have been put in place that are keeping things sort of ticking along. Once all of those disappeared, we're just waiting to see the absolute explosion of the need for more housing, more affordable housing. The 150 million that's just been announced, absolutely, it's fantastic. It's keeping people, homeless people, housed for a while. It can keep them housed for a bit longer after they come out. The support services are being put in there around them to assist them to be moving out. What happens once that money runs out for the private rental market? There are still not enough social housing homes out there to be housing the huge numbers that we're going to be facing. So, you know, 68% of part-time workers are women. 37% of full-time workers are women. So all of these statistics are demonstrating the inequity that are experienced throughout women's lives. 64% of people seeking homelessness support in Victoria are women, and 47% of those are escaping family violence. And we know the number that go to the homelessness services and cannot be assisted is just huge. It's the reason why, yes, many of these women and their children go back to get the roof over their heads, but they're going back into violent relationships and situations that are just not safe. And if we're talking about the older women, definitely all of that, what I've just talked about, can then impact for an older woman, and you know, throughout her whole life, she gets to older age, has less superannuation, less savings. It can be, as Jane said, you know, can it be a health issue? Can it be leaving a partner? If she's been partnered, can it be the partner dying? Can it be the loss of a job? It's, you know, for many of us, it's not far away from moving into that homelessness situation. And I remember when we did our first research into older women and housing, and it was back in 2013, and I stood up at our annual general meeting and wanted to launch the first research that we did about it. And I stood up and I said, well, in fact, in reading this is me. And, you know, I could hear people in the audience sort of laughing. And I just said, no, I worked in the community sector for the majority of my life. When I first started, there was no superannuation. when I did work for government for a while. I left there. They paid my superannuation out. And yes, I was in the lucky position, absolutely, to have a home, and I used it to extend the house, which was great. I was very lucky. I then got back into the community sector, no superannuation, until it was required that superannuation be paid. And I am very lucky now to be in a role where I earn a reasonable income and I'm able to stack away money into my superannuation. But if I hadn't been in that situation, I'd be looking, and I'm talking 7 years ago now, and it sort of clicked, and I thought, my word, I better do something about this. But the other thing that's come through from many of the other people too, that in saying, well, yes, those of us who are lucky to have family and friends who can potentially pick us up if situations happen. That's what I've said for years about the women that we house, that they don't have those support mechanisms that many other people do have in place. That's why they need our housing. That's why they need the subsidised homes. That's why they, many of them have not got that family, have not got the friends that have been able to support them. Many of the women we house are actually from refugee backgrounds, the trauma that some of them have experienced. So the women escaping family violence, they've had to cut themselves off and move maybe to other states to get the housing and the homes that they need. So there's, I think, because you can hear people sometimes out there saying, oh, well, why do they need it? Why don't they just pull themselves up on their bootstraps? Can I just say, when we house the women in their homes, and they are homes, and yes, we can connect support organisations around them, which they may need, and we try very much not to be creating dependence, but independence. But they do need those supports, particularly in the beginning. Those women are just to be admired so much for how they move on with their lives and facilitate the moving on of the lives of their children. We have children going to university now for the women. We have school kids, some of the kids who are school refusers going to school. We have women, apart from being able to now get on much better with their parenting, getting part-time work or going back to study. So the difference that home makes in them being able to move on with their lives is just fantastic. But the older women and housing issue, just to get back to that, my word is it people know that between 2011 and 2016 there was a 30% increase in the number of older women experiencing homelessness in Australia. For Victoria, it was a 67% increase. It's such a huge issue that we need to be addressing, and it's a gender inequality issue that we need to be addressing. So there's housing, there's gender inequality, there's family violence, there's so much. At Women's Property Initiatives, we're doing as much as we can, but there needs to be a lot more investment, so much more investment from government in the housing. And we're hoping the recovery package will be providing some of that money. In Merinda, we have about 50,000 households on the Victorian Housing Register in Victoria. It equates to about 90,000 people. It's huge. Yeah. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Wow. I think we're already seeing how complicated this issue is, how many different ways you can come at it, and how many different ways you can fall into it. I was going to open up, I've got another few questions here, but I've got a question here, I think, from Jacinta Damazi about community. And I think I'd like to pick up on that now, because I think all of you have touched on community in different ways, be it kind of a lack of community, therefore you fall through the cracks, or a need to build community once you find housing. And Jacinta's asked, how can community be nurtured and maintained in a public housing model? So I suppose from each of your perspectives, how do we how do each of your individual, how do you each individually do it? How do you think about it now? She said here that Margaret Simmons wrote about the community in Flemington and North Melbourne as she bore witness to the lockdown of the Housing Commission towers. So how do we kind of maintain community in the face of that kind of thing and foster community, I suppose? Does anybody want to start?
Well, I'd just like to maybe mention one thing, just picking up on something Jeanette said, that we know family violence is a huge driver of homelessness amongst older women, and that one of the things we also know about the perpetrators of family violence, abusive men deliberately separate the women they're abusing from their community. So they set out to, and usually succeed in, creating real barriers between the women that they're abusing and their families, their friends, so that when they do get out of those abusive relationships and they're looking for that community. And I put a thing in response to Jacinta's great question about Margaret Simon's work, that it's just basic stuff like you need to go to a job interview, and so you want your neighbour or your sister or one of your friends to look after your kids or lend you a suit, or just run through the job application and your CV with you. And if you, all these things that we take, those of us who have that community take for granted, if you are isolated, imagine trying to apply for a job when you can't get somebody to say, hey, can you proofread this application for me? Can you, does this suit look right? Does this shirt look okay? Does my hair look okay? Can I come and talk to you about it afterwards, just to debrief? These are the small things, but this is what community does. So when you say to somebody, well, to have a house, not a house, but to have a roof over your head, you have to move away from all the people that provide that. This is why you will often have women say, no, I would rather sleep in my car in my local area than have a roof over my head 50 kilometers away where I can't have that contact. So one of the things I think that we absolutely need to be thinking about with social housing and public housing is not just that it's, oh, it's all right, we can ship everybody off to the other side of Cranbourne and they'll be fine. It's where are communities, where are the people that are actually going to help these people make their lives more secure as much as they can? How can we rebuild that? And one of the ways that we do that is by recognising the existing community and the things that have been enormously successful, like talking to somebody the other day, you know, when you, for those people who have children, when you have your baby, they set you up with the local baby groups through well, they did it when my kids were little, the maternal and child health, and you'd go to meet up with people who'd had babies in your, sort of within a 10-minute walk of your area. You'd meet up once a week. And some of those people are still friends now because we went through all that baby stuff together. The local library does a lot of pulling people in who are interested in various things. They've got a group of people who read crime books together. And so they run book clubs, those kind of things. And there's an enormous sense of community in a lot of different ways around where I live now that I would not ever move away from. And those things are relatively easy to do because people naturally gravitate towards community. We are very social animals and we want our communities. So providing those spaces to find that and make those connections is often all you need to do, and people will take it from there. But that's got to be built into our concept of housing, I think.
I think that's a fantastic point, and it made me think of the women that Merinda works with, and how they've been incredibly dislocated. I suppose once you put in prison, that's probably the most extreme kind of dislocation from community that you can imagine in society. How do the women that you work with, Merinda, how do they deal with that and regain the sense of that, or is that strong to begin with? And then, you know, how do you foster that for women who are coming out of prison?
Oh, so many things are floating through my head from this conversation. And to pick up on what Jane was talking about, firstly, it made me think about gentrification and the way in which, particularly, I mean, I'm familiar with, you know, the gentrification that's happening in Redfern, in Sydney, and the way that people who live in social housing are being pushed out of the inner city into the western suburbs. And I'm sure, you know, it's happening in other places as well that I'm not familiar with. But when you think about Redfern, particularly as a site of Aboriginal resistance, you know, I remember moving to Sydney from a country town when I was 17, and, you know, Redfern was the place that I went because it was my home away from home, and there were other Aboriginal people there who I could immediately connect with. That's where I was able to access services that I felt comfortable accessing. And now for me to walk down Redfern, I'll be lucky to see another Aboriginal person, which just blows my mind. But I think, yeah, like when you're talking about moving, you do need to think about that, because those are communities, and that's where people feel comfortable accessing services, and particularly the people who live in social housing. That's really important. I was thinking about, and I'll address your question in a second, but I was also thinking about the ways that communities operate, and to flip it on its head, the way in which policies and systems operate to dissolve those, and to make it mean that the way that people are living doesn't fit within that policy or system. And when I think about my clients, I think about the way in which, you know, people live quite fluidly, particularly my clients. They might not sleep at the same house every night, or they might live with multiple extended family members, and might have people coming and going all the time. That's a really Aboriginal way of living. And that's about kinship and connection. But that doesn't necessarily fit within the way that public housing is set up. And, you know, I've had instances where, you know, the department has tried to say, you know, I know you've got X person living there. They're not allowed to be there. We're going to start charging you market rent now because that person's living there. And, you know, then they start getting into rent arrears, and then they can lodge termination proceedings, and that person can end up on the street. I mean, that's how it happens, because policies aren't set up to accommodate for people's way of living and for that sense of community. And, you know, Aboriginal people will quite often prioritise those relationships of kinship over their tenancy obligations. I see that all the time. And then to talk about your, to address your question about what happens for women leaving custody, what I quite often see is, you know, a lot of people don't come from Sydney, but they will inevitably, if they go into custody, they'll inevitably end up in a prison in Sydney. That's where the majority of our prisons are in New South Wales. And so what happens when they get out, they often don't have any housing to go to. They'll get released from custody with a small amount of money, maybe a bus pass, and that's it. And so people get released into the community from prison without any kind of through care, including a way to get home. And that places an enormous burden on, you know, government systems.
I actually just want to pick up on that before we maybe go on with community. I saw a woman called Jenny Sams speak last year, and she is among kind of other things. She's the director for the Council of Homeless Persons, and she's the past CEO of Aboriginal Housing Victoria. And when I saw her speak, she spoke about her time at Aboriginal Housing Victoria and how while she was there, they achieved housing accreditation. And she had asked the Premier at the time, I think it was Daniel Andrews, she had asked him if they had achieved housing accreditation, would he hand over ownership of the housing units that they were managing. And she achieved the housing accreditation, and he handed over 1,450 houses to Aboriginal Housing Victoria, which was quite an amazing achievement, I might suggest. And what I thought was really amazing about her speaking about this, she spoke very pragmatically, it was quite incredible, was that she talked about the importance of self-determination. And I think that listening to you speak, you know, you start to understand the complexity, like there's not one way to address this issue. Like there are lots of different ways that this issue needs to be addressed. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more maybe about the importance of self-determination and I mean, I don't know what in terms of specifically, but whether you have any thoughts on that and how we might foster that better.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think when you're talking about self-determination, it really has to come from a community standpoint in terms of what community wants on a collective level. And probably, you know, my context from New South Wales and what, you know, I understand is probably quite different to people from other states. But you know, it's about people and potentially self-determination, you know, Aboriginal communities being self-determining and, you know, addressing their issues in the ways that, you know, make sense to them, overcome some of these things that I'm talking about the ways that people want to live their lives and the ways that we view ourselves in the world. And also the way in which we resolve disputes, because, you know, our dispute resolution systems when it comes to overcoming barriers in housing don't accommodate us either. And if we are allowed to be self-determining and if we are able to resolve that and disputes, then we can take into account all these other overlapping complexities like native title, the way that native title interacts with your connection to land, the way that land rights or your right to membership to an Aboriginal housing corporation interacts with your relationship to this other person who might also be your cousin, but who is also potentially your landlord. And so I think, you know, Western systems can't necessarily accommodate those and they don't get the outcome that you need.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've answered your question at all. I just went on a tangent, but
I think it sounds like it's about the services that are provided as well. So we can provide housing as a kind of a physical thing, but it's the kind of expectations or the understanding or the culture, the different cultures that go with inhabiting and occupying those houses that then creates that sense of community or reinforces that sense of community. And I would imagine that, say, Jeanette dealing with refugee populations and different kind of cultural expectations of housing, and Amanda dealing with mental health issues and the kind of different issues that then impact how you want to live or the demographic that's in those houses, then starts to really, you know, you start to see how nuanced the services that you need to provide for the different cohorts are. I wonder if Amanda and Jeanette would like to talk a little bit more about the kind of specifics of the housing they provide in relationship to community.
Well, just before I talk about our housing, before I worked at Women's Property Issues, I was actually the manager of a women's homelessness service in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And I have this distinct memory of a woman having her being made an offer in one of the high-rise towers, and the worker at the time suggesting that she shouldn't take that housing because it wouldn't be a nice place for her to live. Could wait and see what else she could get. And the response from that woman was, my community's there. I know many women and many families who are living in this high-rise tower. So I don't think we should necessarily assume that there isn't community within those high-rise towers. In fact, many of them have created their own communities, and I forget exactly, but it was an African community that she was from, and for her, she said, I'll be able to trust leaving my children because with other women or other families in that tower, that's where I want to go. So it was a real learning for some of the workers there who were, have their own judgment. I suppose we were being judgmental in a way, and they were saying that's my community. And I suppose also some of the homes that we provide are out a little bit out in the western suburbs, and the same thing has been happening. They are standalone houses, 3 and 4 bedroom houses for women-headed households with a few children, but it has become that many of them are from refugee backgrounds, and they are from similar communities, and they're very much like where they're living, and and creating their own communities. It is so important. That is so important. And look, there's we're actually also working on a different project for some older women up in Dalesford, which I can see Mary Faith's here, and it's called Women in Co-housing. For those who want to be part of a co-housing community, what a fantastic way to create community and to be able to incorporate social housing, housing for, in this case, we're very much looking for housing for women who can't afford to necessarily fully buy in, but we're really trying to get some subsidy in there so that they can put in a bit of money and been subsidised in other ways. And then women who can afford to buy in. Clearly, they all need to be committed to what co-housing is about. But what a fantastic, supportive, environmentally sustainable, community to be in. So, community is what it means for different people, and delivering that is so important. And yes, we try very hard in all aspects. But to some extent, with our housing, we say co-housing, that is absolutely fantastic for the women who want to be co-housing. But for many of our housing, it's for the women just to be part of the community, but not a social housing community. It's they're part of their community in that wherever their house is, and that they're not necessarily, they're not identifiable as social housing tenants that any different from anyone else within their community, but they can live with dignity and start contributing to their community, be part of their community. So yeah, look, because many of the women have come from vulnerable backgrounds, it's not only good for social mix, but it's excellent so that they're not identifiable. Because some of them are still very vulnerable. Yeah, sorry, I went off a bit of a tangent there. Amanda, over to Amanda.
I think that we can all see that everybody's different. We're all different, and the people that we house are different. And Merinda and Jeanette have really talked about different groups, And so the housing needs to be different for each of these different groups. And so that's one of the reasons why community housing is so important, and that government should, be encouraging community housing organisations with some funding, is because we're able to cater to all the different groups that we know so well. So for us in leafy green Kew and Hawthorn, where there's no homelessness in Burundara, let me tell you that there is. And we get people from, other suburbs, but people actually want to live in the nice leafy green suburbs of Kew and Hawthorn. And I don't think that they should be excluded from being able to do that, as Merinda said, because of gentrification and the fact that they used to, many, many years ago, poorer people were able to live in that area, but now they can't because the wealthy have completely taken over the suburbs. So, I've got a little bit of a secret passion to bring back social housing and bring back an eclectic group of people into these suburbs, because I don't think that these suburbs should be just reserved for the rich, the wealthy and the powerful. So we're working, as I said before, we've got these homes, and yes, they're large homes and they're group homes, and they're not necessarily for everyone, but the people that live there don't have anybody else. And so you could, some of them are on the wait list for public housing and others don't want to be on the public wait list. And sometimes I just, think, come on, why don't you get on? Wouldn't it be awesome to find one day? If you don't get on now, you'll never get your own flat. But they don't want to be alone. And one of our properties has actually got 6 flats on it. So it's a really large block of land. We've taken, basically people have come in off the street, depressed, anxious, certainly not working. And when you get in there and they get with communities, with other people, they get encouraged, they get support, they actually start to get better and rebuild their lives. And so with the flats that we've got on this block, we've been able to take people from the rooming house section and put them into their own flats. Now, does that mean that they go off, they get a job, they get a girlfriend or get a boyfriend and live happily ever after? No, but they've got respect, they've got dignity, they've got their own space, and they've got people around them. So they're actually not social people anyway. And so if we put them into a flat in the middle of, Mitcham or somewhere where they didn't know anyone, they could shrivel up and basically they would die and no one would know. Whereas the fact that we've got deliberate communities that we're building with people just looking out for each other means that these people feel connected, they feel like they belong, and they are thriving in the best way that they can now. We try and have a bit of a mix so that it's not completely, we don't want to become a quasi mental health institution. So we really do try and mix it up as much as we possibly can. It's just that the referrals we keep getting are all for people with mental health issues. So as much as we can, we mix it up. We've got a possible project coming up in this area with a block of flats. And so we've had a good look at the flats and are trying to work out, well, how can we make a community out of a disparate bunch of people in a block of flats? So what we're intending to do is to have at least one maybe single person couple in one of the flats that we know has community values and that would be willing to live in that, live in the flats and give of themselves and watch out for other people. So you've got a key, almost like a lead tenant or some glue that binds that community together and is deliberately there to check in and make sure that people are going okay. And we hope that if this comes off, that these people will thrive and they will eventually reach out into their community and establish themselves within that community but they've got the support, they've got the leg up, they've got us around them. It sounds sort of condescending, doesn't it? But we're certainly trying to make, help them to be as independent and not keep them dependent on us, but to actually help them to grow and become part of a wider and broader community. And we see some people that do it, and others, like I said before, everybody's different, and we can't turn people into social animals if they're not, but we need to care for the ones that aren't.
I mean, as an architect and somebody who just loves cities and the diversity that cities have and Australian cities have, I actually think it's really important that we make a commitment not to create housing in pockets that are, in the far outreaches of suburbia. I actually think it's healthy for all of our cities and all of our urban areas to have a really good, diverse mix of people living in them, be them people who are vulnerable to homelessness and need social housing, or our doctors and our nurses and people who have less ability to afford certain, green leafy suburbs potentially. I think it's good for all of us to get an understanding that the way that we see the world in sometimes our very small circle is not the way everybody sees the world and everybody deals with the world. I think it helps to build empathy and trust in communities more broadly if we can kind of reach out and potentially help people who might need some more help. So that's just my 2 cents, I suppose, about why we actually need to make a commitment to housing people across suburbia in all different places. And I think that what we're seeing is quite a few suburbs in Melbourne are starting to implement affordable housing policies and really trying to look at what it means to create public housing and affordable housing in their suburbs to kind of address this issue, which I think is fantastic. I might go to another question from the audience now. And this is probably one a little bit more for Jeanette and Amanda, but Amy's interested in the funding models for public housing and for affordable housing, and what we might do to enable more affordable housing projects to come about, and what the government, I suppose I might add a little bit to that question, and what the government might do to really start to encourage more projects to happen.
Do you want me to go first, Amanda? Okay. So look, the majority of the community housing organisations have relied very much on government funding in one way or another, usually through grants. Their most recent social housing growth fund was a different model where it's a contribution for 30 years to deliver that social housing. But the government grants that are provided from government never cover the full amount of what the cost of developing or providing the housing is. So there's always a requirement from the community housing organisation usually to contribute up to about 25% in some other way. Now that 25% can be through philanthropic funding. It can be contribution of land if you're lucky enough to get that. It can, and community housing organisations also take out commercial borrowings. But we can't take out much in the way of commercial borrowing. Sometimes people will say, well, look at your balance sheet. You've got quite a bit of equity in the homes that you own to be able to take in to take out big borrowings. But in fact, we have to service the loan from the rental income that we get from the properties, and the rental income that we get from the properties is very low. It's 30% of household income, never more than 75% of market rent. So borrowings are very much limited. There is a whole mixture, I think, out there of how different projects have got off the ground. Sometimes you'll be lucky enough to get a council who might sell you the land at an incredibly discounted price. That counts for an enormous amount. From our organisation, we also get incredible pro bono contributions. So we can say that contributes, to our 25%. don't have to pay the full price or anything for our planners or for some of the, you know, engineering requirements on site and so forth. You know, quantity surveyors, valuations, all of those things cost when you're developing a project. So there would be a whole mixture out there for the delivery of the social housing through community housing organisations. When it comes to delivery of what might be seen as affordable housing, which means that usually for your low income workers, then there's again usually some form of government contribution, but the tenants can pay a little bit of a higher rent, I suppose. Still, we wouldn't want to be paying more than 75% of the market rent, absolutely, or 30% of their household income. But clearly, if they're on a low income, they can pay a bit more. But we've also looked very much for older women, some different models, and for the affordable housing. And it's for some of the women older women who are not actually eligible for social housing in any way. And, you know, they couldn't get onto the Victorian Housing Register because they have managed throughout their life to put away some savings or some superannuation. So it makes them ineligible for social housing, but they don't have enough to be able to enter the, you know, to buy a property. They're of the age where banks won't give them a loan. So, and, you know, we're talking about, you know, 100,000, 150,000, but still not enough to be able to buy a property. So we've looked at a project that we're piloting out in Beaconsfield, where women's property initiatives will actually own the property, but the women who are going to be housed out there will loan our organisation $150,000. They can live in that property for as long as they need to or want to. They will still pay an affordable rent based on their income. We will do all the maintenance, pay the rates. When they need to leave, they will get the full amount of that, what they've contributed, what they've loaned back, plus the Reserve Bank interest rate. Not great at the moment, but hopefully down the track will be better, plus 25 basis points. So they've preserved the money that they've saved over their lifetime. They've had as long as they need to be living in good quality housing that's affordable, that's sustainable, that's being built so they can age in place, so to gold livable standards. We're hoping that the government will look at, you know, also funding models like that in the future. But the other thing around affordable housing, I don't know if some of you may have heard of the Constellation project that PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, has been trying to work on. And I actually sat in on a session that they ran, and one of the breakout sessions was unlocking private investment to help deliver affordable housing. And they have got a model that they've been putting to government, but it's come through very, very clearly that there still needs to be government subsidy of some form, that for private investment, for it to stack up for private investors to be able to invest in affordable housing. And look, the superannuation funds have been working on it and are keen to do this, but they are required to deliver back a certain percentage to their members. They need some form of government subsidy, but that government subsidy would still be less than what it would cost them to be fully delivering the housing themselves. So I'm not sure where they're at with that, but I know they're trying very hard with the federal government to look at that as an option. But I think bottom line is that we need government investment of some sort. We need huge government investment for social housing. You know, if the marketplace doesn't, you know, can't deliver what needs to be delivered, government has to step in. And it's an infrastructure issue. We put money into roads, we put money into public transport. We need to put money into homes. What is more important than delivering a home for somebody? So anyway, I'll hand over to Amanda to see what she's got to say.
I really don't think I've got that much more to add, except to say that, you know, our economy is based on housing as being an asset class now. And the last federal election, when there was discussion around getting rid of negative gearing, obviously didn't get through. And there's basically, if this is the way that Australia wants to operate and to keep housing as an asset class, then the government's going to have to pick up the shortfall, because there's no other way. Well, you know, I mean, Jeanette's outlined some models, but again, there's always going to be this subsidy because of the amount that we charge. We can't cover, someone has to cover the shortfall. So for us, we've got, we lease all of our properties at the moment and go through basically philanthropy, and it's either philanthropy or government, I think.
Yes, so somebody's going to have to step up and step into the space.
It's interesting, Tania, I was just going to say, Amanda and I are both members of the Australasian Institute of Housing, and at the next little webinar we're going to run is basically saying, well, why does government not invest in housing except when there's a crisis? So, you know, it's just the way it seems to be. You know, when the government needs to stimulate the economy, oh, well, maybe we'll build some social housing because it'll create jobs, which is good, you know, the construction industry. But why can they not see that they need to do that on an ongoing basis, not just when we've got a global financial crisis or a COVID, you know, a pandemic? They need to be doing it ongoing.
Yes, well, I mean,
Sorry, Tania, interrupted.
I think that the structure of politics is something that, yes, we're not going to solve at all, nowhere near. So hopefully we're in the right moment where a crisis might create some kind of opportunity to start addressing this in a more comprehensive and long-term way. We've got a question here from Yumi from Merinda. Merinda, have any inroads been made to get the Department of Housing in New South Wales to accept the different ways housing needs to be set up to accommodate the cultural differences? Oops, you've got you're on mute still.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I mean, there are parts of the department's policy that recognise that Aboriginal people live in different ways. For example, it's part of their policy in New South Wales to enable Aboriginal people to apply for housing with an extra bedroom, taking into account that Aboriginal people are probably more likely to have extended families staying with them quite often. And there's also a policy that enables succession of tenancies, noting that quite often people will have lived in a house potentially with their parents for, you know, I have a client who's lived in his house, who lived in the house with his mother, and, you know, he's been in the house for over 20 years. So there are certain aspects of it that accommodates different ways of living, but I think as a bureaucracy, it almost doesn't have the ability to take into account. It's built on a Western system, you know.
Yeah, so it needs to be comprehensively reviewed, I suppose, would be a starting point for that. I don't know how you get government to do that, but
yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask Jane a question now. I suppose the question of women and invisibility has come up as a bit of a theme. And I was wondering, and I think it was quite interesting to hear Merinda talk about that, but also to just hear Jeanette talk about the ineligibility for services, that if you're not quite homeless yet, you don't really have access to. And when you were in that position, what kind of services would have been useful to you, and what do you think we need to learn from those situations?
Well, I think, you know, listening to everybody, that I hope the audience will go with me on this, but I think part of the problem in this is patriarchy, that we're talking about, when all these women are talking about the services they're offering and the huge amounts of different things that are needed, the assumption is always that government's not interested really in getting involved. You know, I was making notes as people were talking about the amount of philanthropy that providing social housing depends on philanthropy. No one expects that defence should depend on volunteerism and philanthropy. That is something that we just automatically expect the government will run well. They will fund enormously. There will be people in charge of making sure every single bit of it works. Treasury, the traditional things that men can get all chesty about, are funded really well and thought of as priority for governments. Doing things like assisting homelessness and having that integration from the local level right up to the federal level. So you've got people like Amanda and Jeanette and Merinda saying, these are our needs in this community, that then funnel up to the way it works in defence. And I've worked with defence before. I know you've got tiny little 16-person units going right up, and they're all funded. The logistics is all sorted out. Everything is in place to make sure that the pyramid works. And that's a priority because that's what government thinks it should be doing. Government does not think its role is to help its citizens, which, when you think about why we elect governments and why we are willing to pay taxes to them, is bizarre, because we are willing to do that so that the citizens of our country are looked after. When I'm earning money, I want to pay my taxes because I want kids in schools, and I want airport control towers, and I want social housing for people who are struggling, because everybody is safer if the people in having the worst luck are looked after. It makes everybody's life better. It makes everybody's life safer. And to change that perspective on government, I think is actually, you know, it sounds huge, but I don't think it's that difficult to change. I think it's a matter of changing the way we think about voting. It's a matter of changing the way we think about politics, and it can be done. If we believe that it's possible, a lot of what stops people aiming for political change is the problem seems so huge and so difficult to overcome. And even if you think about what we've talked about tonight, it's this big and this wide, and how can we possibly do anything about it? Well, we can. Because if we could put a government in place, and particularly with this COVID panic, which I don't think has created any problems, but it's torn apart the fault lines that already existed. And people are absolutely going to see that those fault lines exist, and when the least of us is in danger, most of us are in danger. If any woman is not safe, no woman is safe. And those things now are becoming so much more obvious. Now is the time that we can make that change. I really believe that strongly, because it's something that we can't ignore anymore. It used to be easy for the majority of us to ignore that this exists. And we can't do that now because those fault lines are all exposed. This is the time to push for that universal change, because I live in St Kilda in Melbourne, and it's a very diverse group, and we've got social housing living next door to millionaires, which, you know, is how it should be, but we need more social housing, and we need more types of social housing. And that has become incredibly obvious around here because of people all living very close to each other. And overnight we did it. We went from huge numbers of people living, library just across, like out my window, I can see the back of it. There's huge community of people that live there. And all of them have been moved to homes somewhere now. And that happened overnight. We went from years and years and years of government saying it wasn't possible, we can't do it, it would cost too much money, bang. Suddenly, yes, it can be done. And that proved how easy it was once the will is there. And I think with that support there from the rest of the community saying, yes, that support is there, do it. Governments that offer that are going to offer the whole community something that we're not getting right now. I'll stop going on, but I mean, I'm happy to talk about my experiences. And yes, there were definitely things that I needed that would have helped. But on the other hand, I was in a position where I had people that could offer me those things. that, you know, just that little bit to get over that, the worst of it. A couple of months rent, some help with some bills, the pots of food left on my step, the people who were checking my CVs for typos, because when you're that strung out, you can't think properly and you can't see your typos. And believe me, you don't get the job when your CV is full of typos, you know, those kind of things. Suggestions for work. Somebody needs a cleaner, are you willing to do cleaning shifts? Somebody needs some copywriting, are you willing to do that? Getting bits of work before I could get a job, because they are two very different things. All those things helped, but I was able to find them all because, again, white middle class privilege. I think it's the people that don't have white middle class privilege that when you don't have those things to arrest the slide continues without any abatement at all, and putting those services in place, which again goes back to that community thing we were talking about. Mm. A lot of those things are community. If these services are community-based, they cease to become patronising. It's not the sort of thing that Merinda was talking about of we are going to tell you how you should be helped rather than ask you what you need or what you would like to do for your own community. I think that applies to every community. Margaret's work with the towers during the lockdown. Those communities don't want rich white people coming in saying this is what you need to do to clean up your life, or to say that living in the towers is terrible, because a lot of people actually really think living in the towers is wonderful because of that really strong community they have. So I don't think there was anything that I could say from my experience that isn't in place other than that recognition of this is both a very small local problem and a massive macro problem at the same time, and it needs both approaches to make genuine change.
And it seems to me that we need a lot of political goodwill, not just philanthropical goodwill, and that we need politicians with vision in this area and longer term vision. I mean, the statistics, I think there's interesting research that's come out of Canada that says to house somebody costs, I don't know, $40,000 or something, but to actually then per year, but then to actually wait until they become homeless and then have to house them and provide all the wraparound services that requires costs a huge amount more. And so then when you start to kind of think about, you know, why aren't we looking at this earlier? What are the kind of preventative models that we can put in place to start thinking about this as a, you know, a kind of a whole of community issue? I think that point that you made, Jane, about it being community at kind of every level. It's like, you know, what is our community? What is our society? What do we want and what do we value at that level before you become homeless? And then what do you need when you're living in a vulnerable position? How do you actually build community and keep that strong when you're in that position? Because I think that's in lots of ways what housing people in homes, as you know, differentiated from housing, is all about. It's like how we treat people with dignity and respect, no matter where they are in their lives. And what that means for us as a society, because how we treat our most vulnerable people really, I think, reflects on us and who we are and who we want to be. So that idea that you can get out and vote and think about what the policies are around this, or you can write to your local politician and you may think it doesn't make a difference, but you know, maybe sometimes it does. And if there's enough letters and enough passion and care, maybe we'll find the right politician to champion, or the right set of politicians to champion the issue. I can only hope anyway. Now I was going to ask everybody as a little closing comment or closing question is, what is the one biggest change that you'd like to see? But I'm kind of thinking that that's maybe not the question I should be asking, because it doesn't seem like we need one change. It seems like we need more than one change. So I don't know if anybody has one change that they'd like to see. If they do, please feel free to speak up. Otherwise, I could probably just make a few little comments at the end. Is there a one change?
Look, I don't think it is one change, but addressing gender inequality is, you know, is a really, really big, important issue. And the state government has their, you know, their policy to do it, but I'm not really seeing it in action. So, you know, it's just not being rolled out. And even some of the sessions, it's a while ago now that I attended, when they were looking at developing, I thought, you know, even just some of the questions they were asking were not the right questions. It was, well, how do women get a work-life balance? And I was going, it's not the question. You know, why are you saying, how do women get a work-life balance? You know, so we've got a long way to go. And, you know, some of the stats that I just mentioned, you know, and as I said, absolutely highlighted through COVID, exactly what you said, Jane, these issues were there before. It's being, you know, we're seeing them much more roll out because of COVID around the casualisation of the workforce and the fact that it's the women that are in these casual jobs or part-time jobs and losing them and so forth, that it's not because of COVID, you know, it's yeah. Anyway, that's for me, if there's one thing.
It's not a small thing though, is it? It's quite a large thing. Merinda or Amanda, do you have one thing that would make a huge difference in the space that you work in? Oh, Merinda, I think you're still on mute. Again.
That must be the most said statement during COVID. You're still on mute. I think that's a huge question, and I think there's a lot to be said for centering Indigenous ways of being and doing, and you know, our relationship to land and connecting to that over capitalism and patriarchy. So there is that, just a small thing. But I think, and, you know, like I can also say, you know, abolishing prisons, let's start there, because prison doesn't rehabilitate anybody and it's a pathway to homelessness. So, yeah, just that.
Not small either, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Amanda?
I think that with this group, it really is speaking to the converted, but one thing, and I don't know where, you know, everybody's living in a different location, obviously, but please support community housing or public housing in your area, and advocate to councils that you actually want it. And, you know, just maybe, you know, I get surprised sometimes in our local area that how much people support us. And then when I talk to councillors, they will argue, oh, you know, people in our electorate don't want social housing. Well, that's baloney. So there are people, it's just that not enough people are actually talking to politicians and councillors and saying, we agree with social housing and we want more of it. So I think that we, you know, for those of us that are here, we can be a bit, we can help by being proactive in that space.
I think that's a good piece of advice. It's a good takeaway action that we can actually all, you know, we can all make change with. Even if it's small, you know, if we all amplify our voices, we can amplify the issue. Hopefully, Jane, you kicked off what's the one big change, but did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I agree with Merinda. We've got to overthrow capitalism, patriarchy, land rights, and then go from there after we've sorted those ones out. But I think probably more than all the everything we need to change, I think one of the things that I would like to see is to give people hope to change their ability to make change, or their perception of their ability to make change. I think that's often, it feels, as I said before, too big and too hopeless. And it is it is surprising how much sending emails to your local member, and it's very easy to find you all there on Google. It's all free. And everybody's, well, particularly in Victoria, we're all sitting at home going slowly out of our minds. Use some of that time to start emailing your local members, state, federal and local. It is surprising how much difference it makes, because very few people do it. They think that it won't get read, that it's only going to get read by a staffer, and that's probably true if it's only one. But again, social media is hugely powerful. And the clicktivism thing, clicktivism can be powerful if you pre-write for people, here's the letter, the email, here's the email address, just copy paste. All it's going to be click, 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 done. And suddenly 300 emails land in the inbox of your local MP talking about Aboriginal land rights, or talking about social housing, or talking about any of the things that you think are important. And you get enough people doing that, it is surprising how effective it can be. And suddenly you've got somebody going back to Parliament going, Jesus, I'm on a 2-point margin and we've got an election coming up next year, and I can't go back to these people and say we're not doing anything about it. So give me an answer. And then suddenly they've got to start considering the question and giving an answer, and maybe something might even happen. I think it's absolutely worth trying. I think it's worth making that effort, because without that, what else are we going to do? Just continue to depend on women's unpaid labour to try and deal with a problem that is created by women's unpaid labour? We're just going to end up in a cycle that doesn't end.
Absolutely. And I can attest to the fact that if you give people ways to act, they will act, and people do sometimes listen. And it is really, really incredibly important. You think it might not make a difference, but it absolutely does. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers. It's been a wonderful conversation. Their perspectives have been enriching and complex and absolutely fascinating. We can see that housing women is a really, really complex problem. There are many different ways you can end up requiring housing, and no one size fits all. And it's wonderful to see the passion with which our speakers and the nuance with which each of our speakers is dealing with this. It's really, really powerful to me, and I've been really quite moved by listening to you all. And I'd just like to end on a reminder, well, I suppose I'd like to end with a reminder. We're all being told at the moment that we're all in this together. So that's kind of what I'd like us to take away from this, that we all act as a society. All of us make up society, and the way we take care of our most vulnerable reflects on who we are and who we want to be. And I'd like to believe, because I'm mostly an optimist, sometimes I'm cynical and sometimes I'm quite ranty, but I'm mostly an optimist. I'd like to believe that at the moment, in the moment we're in, we can seize an opportunity to become more caring and to actually really develop more empathy, and to then use that empathy and that care to act and develop strategies to fill the gaps that we're seeing with women in housing, and, you know, whatever your passion is, I suppose, more broadly, but tonight, women in housing. And hopefully we can actually make, hopefully the change that will be made in light of the pandemic will make a difference to us for years to come. So I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you very much. I don't quite know. Everybody's on mute, so nobody can hear anybody clapping. It's like the sound of no hands, my hands clapping. Sorry, Zoom is weird. So anyway, thank you all very much. I just want to hand over to Pavit. I think he's got one last thing to say, a little wrap up for Moral Fairground, and thank you all.
Thank you, Tania. Thank you, speakers. And this honestly has been a really, really amazing event. Thank you to the audience as well, because your engagement has made it that much more interesting, that much more engaging, and it is so important. I'm just going to launch a poll right now, and we hope that you'll be able to fill it out, just so that we get a bit of a snapshot of who's been a part of our events and, you know, how we can engage with more people and really get these really strong messages out to the world, and especially as local or as global as we can. So I'm just going to launch it and let you know a bit more about where to go next from here. So one of the things we really strive to do, and this is really part of our networking event series, and I think our biggest challenge has been getting that networking bit right, because online is quite challenging and it brings its own list of things to tackle. So what we've come up with is a solution, a digital solution, if you will. It's an app called Slack, for those who don't know. Slack is a messaging / team communication application. Very popular these days amongst workplaces and colleagues. But what we're trying to do is get all our event attendees together, join in, continue these discussions, because I think one of the I guess flaws of a lot of these conversations is we preach to the converted, and oftentimes everybody tends to experience so much fatigue that it does not necessarily continue and move forward into actionable change. So continue these discussions, carry these messages with you, add your own flavors to it, because as much as our speakers have shared so much, I believe all of you have so much power within and so many perspectives of your own. And, if you package all of that and send it to your councils and your MPs, I think we're going to see a big change. So don't forget to act. And the Slack group is open for everybody. Feel free to ask each other questions. You can share documents and photos, all of that. So, and we'll also obviously share the recording of the video. I'm just trying to look at the chat because we got a few messages. Oh, apologies, everybody. I just realized we missed out a whole bunch of things on the poll. Don't worry about it. Whatever best you can answer, really, that's okay if you don't have to answer. I'm so sorry, apologies from our side. Thank you. Thank you so much once again. I'm just going to be closing the poll. I think we're just over time, so sorry for the extension, but I'm just so happy to be a part of this event, and I'm so happy for everybody to have been a part of it. Thank you so much. Go ahead, kill the world, make a change. Let's be the difference we want to see in the world, and invest on the people around you, I think, as a final message, because as much as we want to invest in a whole load of things in the world today, I think investing in our communities is so powerful. Just like Jane mentioned earlier, just, whoever's around you, write them, help them proofread their CVs, sit their dog when they're going for job interviews, whatever it might be. Let's help each other. Thank you so much. We will send everybody an email for Slack. So don't worry about it. All the emails that you've shared with us, we'll respond with the Slack invite, as well as instructions. And, you can just log in and get the whole spiel. Cheers, everybody.